Hey, it looks like we might have a few people joining. Um, Welcome to my first episode live recording. Um, Looking forward to going through this story with all of you, being able to hear your thoughts and everything. Can everyone hear me okay? I don't know if anyone can get in the chat there, but good. Yeah, I see someone in the chat saying they can hear me. Let me just get this all set up. Yeah, we'll just wait a few more minutes. I don't know if people might have trouble finding um, my YouTube channel. I've never used this YouTube channel for anything before, so we'll just wait a few more minutes. But happy Hamilton Day, everyone! I have my Hamilton birthday party hat. Happy Hamilton Day, especially to everyone who went and made a post about Hamilton's birthday and listed him as being born in 1755. But I did see a couple of 1757s out there. No 1754s though. So that's always good. Not as big a fan of the theory that he was born in 1754. There's not a ton of evidence for that. But we do, keep going back and forth between 1755 and 1757. All right, so yeah, Sarah asked in the chat, why is there a debate about his birth year? Um, I don't remember all of it. I think that Hamilton told people he was born in 1757, but we had some evidence that he was born in 1755. I think we had some sort of, yeah, that maybe at some point he said that he was born in 55 and later he said he was born in 1757. I'd have to look at the specifics again. But yeah, so we're not really sure when Hamilton was born. There's no like record actually of his birth. So we just have to kind of use records from later. Yeah, where people mention how old he is at various points, and it does differ. And then the 1754 one came up recently. Someone found a document he had signed that they thought he wouldn't have been able to sign unless he was a bit older. So they, yeah, set it back to 1754, and they even thought that maybe he wasn't born on January 11th. Um, but I don't know that there was as much evidence for that. I think because what age you have to be to sign documents kind of varies more widely than people sometimes expect. And yeah, we don't have any evidence of him ever saying he was born in 1754. But yeah, we have evidence of people saying 55 and then 57. So yeah, that gets kind of weird. I think the like the Museum of the American Revolution in their Instagram posted 1755 or 1757, and then I think the Hamilton musical said 1757. So yeah, different people pick different ones. 1755 or 1757 is probably the best way, probably, to say that. So yeah, we don't know how long ago exactly Hamilton was born, but I do think he was probably born on January 11th. So it's some birthday for him. let me just check some things here, and then I guess we can get started in just a minute. All right, so I guess we will get started then with the recording. So I'm just gonna start here with the intro that I had on the original blog post because I think it was a good intro. Kind of sets the tone for this. So in 1757, Baron Friedrich Wilhelm Ludolf Gerhard Augustin von Steuben arrived in America to help save the new nation from certain defeat. Steuben was soon named Inspector General, a position in which he not only taught the amateur army so much needed discipline, but organized the swarming multitude of details the army had been unable to get under control, such as the sizes of units and the supplies for each soldier. Unbeknownst to most of his colleagues, Steuben's ability to pull chaos together extended into his personal life. From amongst a society that viewed same-sex attraction as a moral defect, Steuben punked young same-gender attracted men who needed guidance and somewhere to belong and gave them a family. So, yeah, I mean, we kind of start the story with Steuben and what was going on with his sexuality. And, kind of strikingly, there's no evidence at all at any point in history, any point in his life, of Steuben having a relationship, sexual or romantic or both, with a woman. The only thing, there's like this one story that kind of bounces around out there. And, I think for people who have like done any research on Steuben, you're probably like tired of hearing it brought up. But yeah, I did find this one thing. Historian Bob Arnebeck had this quote from um, this young man, John Mulligan, who we'll talk about more later. He was a young man at the time, he knew Steuben, and he told a story years after Steuben's death of he was traveling with Steuben, and this like small portrait fell out of Steuben's bag of a woman, and he was like, "Oh, who is that?" And Steuben is quoted as having said, "Oh, she was a matchless woman." And so that's like the one evidence of people like, "Oh, see, he was attracted to women because there was that woman that he said was matchless." Um, that obviously, in my opinion anyway, is not really evidence of anything. We don't know, just because he seemed to have respect for this woman, that he had a relationship with her. It could have been a relative or a friend. And then, of course, we don't even know that this story actually happened. Mulligan told it years after Steuben's death, and it's possible that he just told it, kind of to salvage Steuben's reputation by saying like, "Oh, see, he had relationships with women. There was nothing strange going on there." But yeah, that's as close as we come to any evidence that Steuben had any relationships with women. And yeah, as I said, that could have been to salvage Steuben's reputation because it was kind of known throughout Steuben's life that he had relationships with men. So one, like the biggest thing where that kind of starts, we have this letter. I was able to find this quote through the blog Homo History, a quote where one of Steuben's old friends writes to someone else and says, "It has come to me from different sources that," sorry, my screen turned off there. "It's come to me from different sources that Steuben was accused of having taken familiarities with young men which the laws forbid and punish severely. I have even been informed that this is the reason why Steuben was obliged to leave Heidegem, and that the clergy of your country intend to prosecute him by law as soon as he may establish himself anywhere." And that was written while Steuben was living in France. And they use the phrase "young men" in there, and there has been a lot of debate recently. Translation is a difficult thing, and a lot of meaning gets put into things. So there's been some debate: was the letter originally supposed to say boys? Was it young men, or was it just men? Like, I've seen it quoted all three ways. People have been using the boys translation a lot, and so some people have like kind of turned that into Steuben was accused of sexually assaulting minors. We don't know that. I would definitely not take this letter as evidence of that. First of all, because there's dispute over the translation of should it be boys or young men or men. And then also, boys can kind of mean different things in different languages and different eras. I recently was looking through a bunch of different records from Paris in the 1700s of like arrest records for sodomy. And they frequently say like, "Oh yeah, we arrested this boy. He was 28 years old." And obviously to us, it's like, that's not a boy. They used boy in a couple of different ways, and often it just meant that you were like, you're like an apprentice, or you're like training to be like a guildsman, you're training in some sort of craft. And like you weren't quite there yet. So yeah, it could kind of mean like professional position, like position in society more than age. Um, so yeah, I don't know for sure which translation is right. Um, yeah, as I said, I got that quote. That letter was quoted on the blog Homo History, and I don't have in front of me where they got it. Um, so I'm not exactly sure whose translation they're using, but there are kind of those differing translations. I would not say that this is strong grounds um, to accuse Steuben of having relationships with minors at all. But yeah, so these rumors, at any rate, that Steuben had relationships with men did continue. Arnebeck tells us that they came up kind of again and again. When Steuben was in America, it got brought up when he was in the military, and then later in his kind of limited involvement in politics. But when he did get involved in politics, and like just throughout his life, like these rumors constantly followed him wherever he was. People were aware of this reputation. Um, we even have a letter from Steuben to William North, who we'll talk about a little bit later. And we have quoted by Arnebeck, we have this letter where Steuben says that this is like after the war, and he was trying to get Congress to give him more money in compensation for his service. And he says that Congress does not want to reward a quote old bachelor. And so it has been suggested that possibly what he meant there was because of his reputation of being attracted to men, that Congress is like a little bit embarrassed that he was a big part of how we won the American Revolution. And so, yeah, and so that's why they didn't want to give him money. So that could suggest that it was, again, like a very widely known thing, and a thing that, kind of worked against him at several points in his life. Um, Although it's also possible that what he meant by old bachelor was that, like, because he kept running out of money in kind of the later half of his life, and he never really, um, like after the American Revolution, he didn't really work. Um, and they may have been suggesting that he could have married um, to fix his financial problems. That's not uncommon at the time. And so they might be saying like, "Oh, why should we give you money when you haven't tried this means of getting money? Marrying a rich woman." So it may not be necessarily a reference to Stephen being attracted to men, but even if it was about the fact that he didn't marry, that's still telling as well that he hadn't married, and that seems kind of like evidence that he had never even like, he hadn't been courting. There was no talk of him possibly marrying. That was just something he was not going to do. Um, but yeah, so that's very interesting. So what this all kind of comes down to was that Steuben was very much out, as we would say now. Like, people knew he liked men, and he ended up having to live his life that way. So that's Steuben. So then the first two people that we're going to talk about, kind of, being pulled into the sort of family that Steuben sets up, is Benjamin Walker and William North. So when Steuben showed up in North America, the Continental Army is kind of, a mess. It's sort of in pieces. Um, so Steuben kind of had to, pull everything together. He created training regimens and kind of taught, these sort of random people who would come together how to be an actual military. Steuben had been in military life since he was 14. His father was a soldier, and he brought Steuben with him to, like, basically just to go be with the army and travel around as, he's in the Prussian army as they're, like, fighting wars and stuff, even before Steuben was actually old enough to be part of the military. Steuben joined as soon as he was old enough, and then that was his whole life for a very long time. So Steuben definitely had a lot of experience and knowledge that the Continental Army needed. He also, the Prussian army at that point was very capable, was very powerful, um, but they were also very different than the British army. So he kind of provided, this strong foundation for learning about warfare that was still at the same time not the way the British were doing it, which was helpful as, alternative strategy. So yeah, Steuben did a lot, but when he first showed up, he only spoke Prussian, which was kind of a problem. It's hard to train English speaking troops when all you speak is Prussian. Um, and it would be like he had translators, he had an assistant with him, um, Etienne de Ponsu, who spoke French, and it kind of went, and Prussian, it kind of went through this whole translating thing. I had to translate through him. And so, yeah, as sort of legend has it, one day while Steuben was training, Benjamin Walker stepped forward and said that he actually spoke Prussian. And so that was very helpful for making translation much easier. And it made, putting Steuben's plans into effect a lot simpler, made Steuben much more effective. And Walker continued to serve with Steuben as his aide de camp for pretty much the rest. Sorry, my equipment fell over there. He saved Steuben for pretty much the rest of the war. Eventually, he did leave Steuben's staff and served as an aide de camp to George Washington. But according to historian William E. Benjamin, Walker was so close to Steuben that even after he left Steuben's staff, he was seen as like a link to Steuben. So, like, if you wanted to talk to Steuben, you're trying to persuade Steuben to do something, like you needed some sort of connection to Steuben, Walker was there. And he was sort of seen as like, yeah, still kind of part of Steuben's operation, even once he was no longer actually working with Steuben. So yeah, and then also Benjamin tells us that there was sort of, he says, an element of flirtation in Steuben's letters to Walker. And so yeah, they do develop this very close friendship that does include, when they're apart, writing to each other in this sort of flirtatious way. We don't necessarily know if that turned into any kind of romantic or sexual relationship, but definitely had some elements of that. And then also Benjamin proposes that Walker was sort of willing to flirt with Steuben and allow Steuben to flirt with him in exchange for stuff. He would frequently write to Steuben asking Steuben to buy him things that he claimed he needed, and so Steuben did become kind of a sugar daddy, maybe you would say, in some ways, to Walker for a little bit. But it seems like Steuben was never like bothered by Walker using him to get stuff, and like they were both pretty much happy with that arrangement, whatever that was. So then William North, who I think may have actually gone by Billy, but I'll just keep calling him William North because I don't know him that well. I'm not his friend. So, but Steuben met North originally at a ball given in honor of Steuben's arrival when he first arrived in North America. And this one Steuben biographer, Lockhart, said that North referred to Steuben as graceful when they first met. North would join Steuben's military family in 1779, and they worked together well. Lockhart tells us that North really respected Steuben, but was unafraid to tell Steuben what he thought of him. He was always, very honest about his opinions of what Steuben was doing if he felt something, wasn't working, which Steuben really respected. So, yeah, they became good friends. And yeah, Benjamin says that he thinks that maybe North and Steuben had, like, he says, a romantic friendship. And he says that that could have included some sexual intimacy. Definitely their letters seem kind of romantic. And later in life, North would, when he like sort of wrote to Steuben or to Walker about like remembering their time in the military, he spoke of them very affectionately. And even at one point, like, kind of talked about um, thinking of like feeling that his sort of like memories and like the way he misses Walker and Steuben kind of is a betrayal to his wife, which is kind of interesting. Um, but yeah, so there's some evidence that North did have romantic feelings for Steuben, and if he was in love with Steuben was not the only person he was in love with, because there's also evidence of a romantic relationship between North and Walker. So this is kind of a love triangle, not in a competing way, but just in a triangle of three people way. Um, we have a letter from North to Walker, quoted in Richard Godbeer's work, where he says, "When I begin to love you, I know not. The first motion of disregard to Farley, I remember. 'Twas at Tappan. I lay on straw with one blanket." So Farley was another one of Steuben's aides de camp. I don't really have any information on him right now. But some people suggest that maybe there was something going on romantically between North and Farley. So we have this letter from North to Walker where he tells Walker that he doesn't remember when he first started to love Walker, but he remembers when he first started to not care as much about Farley. And I feel like that is good evidence for a romantic relationship because, we're talking about North and Farley being friends. I feel like, or, North and Walker being friends. I don't think it makes as much sense for him to be like, oh, yeah, like this is when I stopped being friends with this person, so I could become friends with that person. Like, I feel like we don't tend to talk about friendship as like that exclusive of a thing, unless maybe the like two people were enemies. Maybe you had to stop being friends with one to be friend with the other. Um, but yeah, so it seems to me like the way he talks about that like the start of his love for Walker can like you can kind of mark that by when he stopped caring about Farley. I think that does definitely like that's not kind of the language we would see between friends of this era, and so I think that is kind of like a good indication of a romantic relationship. Um, and then yeah, like I mentioned, William Brenneman, and he also has written that he thinks Walker North's letters were more romantic than was typical between male friends of the era. So that's something that we see a lot doing any kind of queer history is like this idea of, well, that's just how men wrote back then. That was normal. Um, and yeah, definitely like if you had never read any 18th century correspondence before and you come into, like any correspondence from the era, you might think that the people were in love because they did, like the level of emotion and just like kind of drama and poeticness that people wrote with was just like kind of weird by our standards. Um, so I could definitely see how you could misunderstand and think that two friends were in love, not knowing as much about that language. But once you get more into 18th century correspondence, and even like in this like specific couple of decades, and you get very familiar with it, then there is a norm. And once you are familiar with that norm, then you can see some letters and say, well, this still kind of feels like it's outside the norm. So I talked about that a little bit in my articles about Alexander Hamilton and John Lawrence. And yeah, that seems to apply here with North and Walker very much as well. So yeah, from like the evidence we have, it seems that it was actually kind of fun, at least as fun as this can be, because it was in the middle of a war, working on Steuben's staff. So, yeah, Walker and North are very happy. Walker said later, once he switched to working for Washington, that he missed the cheerful air of Steuben's headquarters. Steuben was just a lot more fun. Um, and yeah, Steuben, he was known for like, having parties and stuff during the war. As a major general, he got more rations than some soldiers, and he would like trade and exchange extra food for like small luxuries and stuff, um, and use that to throw parties. And of course, the big one that everyone remembers, we have something Deponsu, Steuben's secretary, wrote later. Um, Sorry, where do I have that quote? Yeah, and I found this quote in an article by Aaron Blackmore, but Duponceau says his aides invited a number of young officers to dine at his quarters on condition that none should be admitted that had on a whole pair of breeches. So that's like a quote that gets thrown around a lot. People think that that seems kind of gay. Um, there is like a little bit of context to that. That the point was that like a lot of the um, like the higher up officers like had more stuff, and you had like regular soldiers, and then even like these junior officers who like kind of barely had clothes. And so I guess sort of the idea of this party is like it's Steuben inviting over for dinner these like younger officers who don't have as much stuff, and trying to make this experience more bearable for them. But that's not to say just because we have that explanation that doesn't mean that there was nothing gay about this. Because yeah, I mean, you can read it that way, and then also like he's like, okay, invite young men as long as they don't wear pants. So yeah, there was that. So with all of these, kind of parties happening, some of which seem kind of interesting, and this like web of romances of maybe North was in love with Walker, maybe he was in love with Steuben, maybe Steuben was in love with Walker, maybe Walker was in love with or at least flirting with Steuben. It seems like Steuben's military family, his headquarters, is like a very open environment. So if any of them were same gender attracted, it seems like they would have not had to hide it from the others. Like they would have been pretty open because, even if they weren't all necessarily in love with each other, that if Walker and North were in love, that would have been something Steuben would have been accepting of, and like sort of vice versa. However, the patterns worked out there. So yeah, they had found a place where they could be themselves. So then the other two people that we have in this, well, two more people that we have in this story, we'll get to two more later, was Alexander Hamilton and John Lawrence, which is what makes this kind of relevant today for Hamilton's birthday. Yeah, so, as I said in my article, though a general staff was called like a family, someone's military family, Steuben's sort of like chosen family that he built up seems to have extended kind of beyond his aides de camp. Hamilton and Lawrence were on George Washington's staff when Steuben came to the army. They ended up both working with Steuben a lot. And sometimes people will be like, oh, yeah, Washington assigned them to work with him because they were all queer. There's not really evidence for that, although it's kind of a fun thought. But they both spoke French. Alexander Hamilton spoke French quite fluently because the islands of St. Kitts and Nevis was, and maybe still is, I'm not sure, although I think their official language is English, but was kind of a bilingual environment, mostly because it kept getting taken over by different European powers. It had been French not long before Hamilton's birth, but was an English colony when he was born, a British colony. But yeah, so Hamilton and Lawrence both spoke French, so they ended up working with Steuben a lot, and they ended up becoming friends with Steuben over time. We have a quote where Lawrence wrote to his father and was telling him about Steuben, and he said, all the general officers who have seen him are prepossessed in his favor and conceive highly of his abilities. So it seems like Lawrence definitely was impressed with Steuben, and they were on good terms and became friends pretty quickly. Later in Hamilton's life, much after the war, Hamilton got several of his children baptized at once. They were not all baptized at birth for some reason, probably because Hamilton had kind of a complicated relationship with Christianity. Eliza went to church every Sunday. Hamilton did not go with her. But yeah, so Hamilton ended up getting like 3 of his kids baptized at once when they were like around 10, around there, each of them. And Yeah, so according to Ron Chernow, Steuben was actually present at the baptism of Hamilton's children. And I think I heard someone may have been kind of like a godfather for them. So obviously, Hamilton became very good friends with Steuben, and that friendship lasted like the rest of their lives. Obviously, Steuben, I think, dying a little bit before Hamilton, although I don't remember exactly when Steuben died. But yeah, and I mentioned earlier historian Lockhart. He suggests that Hamilton, Lawrence, and Steuben had a lot in common. They all really liked military service, um, which is, yeah, I don't know. I think kind of an interesting thing, but Hamilton was really into being in the military. He enjoyed that a lot, and later in his life, really romanticized his days in the military. Um, they're all really into Enlightenment philosophy, and they all had a lot of opinions on politics. So yeah, they definitely became good friends, and yeah, became kind of part of Steuben's community. His little like web of friendship there. Um, and yeah, obviously I've spent my past three episodes discussing that Alexander Hamilton and John Lawrence were probably attracted to men. I've suggested that Hamilton was attracted to men in addition to women, and that maybe Lawrence was attracted to men instead of women. Um, but we're not necessarily like I'm not super firm on that. That kind of could go either way. But trying not to make like a bad bisexual pun there. But so it seems like they were probably some gender attracted, and I don't think that either of them was like in love with Steuben or anything. I'm not suggesting that, but if maybe um, yeah, if that may have been part of like sort of how they ended up becoming friends, if that was part of kind of what drew them together, that they were experiencing their eras. Um, homophobia, such as it was, I guess I say the right term for it, but yeah, experiencing everything that was happening in their society in relation to sexual diversity together. If that was part of their friendship bond, we don't necessarily know, at least initially. Um, and Lockhart stated that Steuben felt he could relax in Hamilton Lawrence's presence. And if Steuben was attracted to men, if that was like very well known, then possibly, if Steuben like definitely felt comfortable around them, that could mean that as well. Um, and the one thing that we do have that really suggests that Hamilton at least, did kind of bond with Steuben apart because of this shared sexual identity, maybe sexual and romantic identity, and that he did see Steuben as kind of, a safe haven, a refuge for this. Is that later, after the war, Hamilton encounters a young male couple in need of a refuge from society's opinions on them, and he directs them to Steuben. So that leads us to the last two members that we have here of Steuben's, yeah, kind of friendship group, um, which is Charles Adams, John Adams' son, and John W. Mulligan. Um, and so they came to contact with Steuben about 10 years after the war. Steuben was living in New York on land that he had been given in exchange for his military service. Congress did give him some things, but he would occasionally ask Congress again. He was not necessarily super good with money, but that was kind of a typical problem of people who were sort of descendant of aristocracy. In that era, they did not have money skills because they didn't really need them. Um, but yeah, so he's living on this land in New York. He'd been given in exchange for his military service. Adams and Mulligan were law clerks working for Alexander Hamilton. And historian Keith Stern tells us that it was during that time, while they're working for Hamilton, that was actually how they met and ended up falling in love. Now, I have an episode I'm going to do later about Charles Mulligan, and we'll get into more the evidence that they fell in love and were having a romantic and maybe sexual relationship, and that is, and like kind of the specifics of their relationship. And we'll like talk about how some of that is like a bit more debatable. So that's not necessarily a super concrete thing that we know, but this is kind of the theory here. So they ended up, yeah, falling in love while working for Hamilton. They started living together. And then Stern suggests, and there is like some documentary evidence for this, perhaps some mentions in letters, that John Adams became suspicious of Charles and Morgan's closeness and demanded that they separate. Um, we definitely do have some evidence that John Adams was kind of homophobic, and he didn't like his son Charles a whole lot, and he frequently disapproved of things Charles was doing and the way Charles conducted his life, and not just in a homophobic way necessarily, but in general. So, yeah, John Adams demanded that they kind of stop seeing each other. They're very upset. They end up connecting with Steuben, and Steuben is helpful to them. And so, where this kind of becomes relevant to our story is this question of like, how, like, where was that link from these two young lovers not knowing like what to do about this um, situation there, and then ending up with Steuben. And so, what it seems like the connection is Hamilton. Um, in the letter where Steuben invites Morgan and Adams to live with him, he mentioned that Morgan's letter was handed to me by Mr. Hamilton, he says. So Hamilton seems to have conducted that introduction between those two men and Steuben. And yeah, and I do think that it is kind of revealing of how Hamilton saw Steuben. I mean, I think it definitely suggests that he may have been, certainly aware of Steuben's same gender attractions, and that Steuben had had a lot of relationships with men. It may also tell us something about Hamilton, like how Steuben interacted with Hamilton and Lawrence. Hamilton and Lawrence is a couple. If Hamilton knew that these, two young men who were in love and didn't know like where they could go to be safe in a relationship, that they would be fine with Steuben. I don't think it's a huge leap to say then that maybe that's what was happening with Hamilton and Lawrence and Steuben. That gatherings with Steuben, evenings spent working with him or partying with him, provided a safe place for Hamilton and Lawrence's relationship, since Hamilton seems to have had it in his mind that Steuben was a safe place for that. So, that tells us a lot about Hamilton's relationship with Steuben, and it also kind of tells us more about what Steuben's network was like in general. And I should mention briefly as well that I think John Mulligan ended up living with Steuben for a little while. I think Charles may have briefly. He did move back kind of to the city and eventually did get married, although there was some evidence that he may have continued having a relationship with possibly John Mulligan, possibly other men as well, having romantic and sexual relationships. And Mulligan lived with Steuben for the rest of Steuben's life, and Steuben like left him money. I think that Mulligan was possibly one of the ones that Steuben like legally adopted, so his inheritance would go to him. And it may have been also a legal way of like kind of marrying him at the time. But and that's something we see in later eras, same-sex couples adopting adopting the other so they can have something like the legal rights granted to married couples, even when like a marriage between them couldn't be legally recognized. So we don't necessarily know that it was happening with Steuben and the men that he adopted. I think he may have legally adopted Mulligan. He may have also legally adopted Walker and or North. So we don't know if they saw that as a replacement for marriage, or if again that was just about inheritance. Steuben he had no children at all that we know of. He did have, I think, some nephews that he did not get along with. So this could have also just been to make sure that his nephews didn't get anything, although he didn't die with a lot to leave to anyone. So, yeah, in conclusion, what we've kind of seen here, Steuben was probably not what we would call straight. He was probably attracted to men. We don't know if this is like exclusively attracted to men, mostly attracted to men, attracted to men and women and other people. I couldn't really say, but it seems like he was probably attracted to men, and I would probably lean towards he was only attracted to men, since that random anecdote about the painting of the matchless woman is all we have in terms of evidence of Steuben having a relationship with a woman. Um, and he didn't marry, even when people were possibly pressuring him to alleviate his financial situation. And just that was, just a very normalized thing at the time, is just you get married. And so it is always, I think, kind of interesting when someone in that era doesn't, because there was just such tremendous pressure to sort of in the force of it being just incredibly kind of aggressively normalized. um, so we also have evidence, as we saw, that Benjamin Walker was probably attracted to men. He flirted with Steuben a lot, and he kind of used that for things. We don't know if he had a romantic or sexual relationship with Steuben. Um, I don't know that a guy who is not attracted at all to guys would think to flirt with a man to get things from him or feel comfortable doing that. So I feel like that could maybe still be evidence, but it could also not be. We don't really know what was going on in Walker's head necessarily. I do think, though, it looks like Walker may have been romantically interested in North. At the very least, we seem to have a lot of evidence that North is romantically interested in Walker, and the way he looks back on that fondly and seems to think it's going well in letters while it's happening, I think would suggest maybe that Walker was interested in North as well. And then, of course, Hamilton and Lawrence, who we've gone over in previous episodes, um, possibly Adams and Mulligan. There seems to be evidence for a relationship that Steuben, kind of harbored, sanctioned, helped them continue. Um, and yeah, just the general vibe seems to be that all of Steuben's friends, most of them were men, and they were men who were same gender attracted. Steuben built up this network, um, where, yeah, these men came together, sometimes maybe because they were in love or having a sexual relationship, and then sometimes just for friendship, because, in the 1700s, sometimes we think of that as a place where you just couldn't be same gender attracted, where you would just have to keep that completely under wraps, and it was just like terrifying and brutal all the time. And that's definitely not true. But that's definitely not to say that it wasn't hard. Sodomy laws did exist, and they did, in some cases, like, call for the death penalty, even if in practice that wasn't always happening. It certainly sets, a vibe for your society when there is a law in place that you could be killed for following your attractions. So that was hard. And so, yeah, they may have just come together kind of in friendship of all having this shared experience. And as I discussed, if Adams and Mulligan are any indication, and if they maybe reflect on Hamilton and Lawrence, possibly also in Walker North, it seems like Steuben became a safe haven for these people and gave them kind of like a family. So yeah, that's that's Baron von Steuben, and I plan on doing another episode on him later on. I want to get more into his life, into the biographical details. That can kind of be hard to do. A lot of records of his early life don't exist. Some of them were actually destroyed by Nazis later on. So that's, yeah. But there is more to learn about Steuben, and I would like to know more about him. I also didn't talk in this episode about DePonsu that much. He was Steuben's secretary, as I said. He was 17 when he arrived in North America with Steuben. There is some evidence that Steuben had a romantic and or sexual relationship with DePonsu, um, which is a little bit creepy. But just because it's creepy doesn't mean we shouldn't, research it. We still have to confront these things. So yeah, I would like to definitely look at that more. I mentioned the allegations of pedophilia that get brought against Steuben. I feel like I've seen kind of a lot of that recently. I'm not exactly sure why that's increased, but I'd like to look more into that. I still think that that one letter is not evidence of that, because I think that's kind of a translation thing, and I don't think that necessarily was supposed to mean boys in the way that we think of it. Um, but maybe it did, and then certainly the relationship with Deponzu is creepy. So I'd like to confront more of that more and just look at, I talk here about Steuben developing this network of young men, developing this friendship group, this like safe haven, but like what was going on specifically for Steuben. Like I would like to look more at like his kind of personal experiences. So that's my plans for Steuben moving forward. But that'll be down the line. I want to get caught up on adapting my older articles into podcast episodes, and then I have a plan for some new material I'm going to do. But yeah, as we wrap up here, did anyone have any questions or comments about Steuben or his story? Yeah, Pasta is very cool. Yeah, I think Steuben is super interesting, and I think the fact that he was able to um, create this community of men and do any of the things he did, um, definitely kind of, I think, paints like a different picture of the queer experience in the 18th century than we usually have. Definitely, it shows the immense amount of oppression and violence that they needed this safe haven, but also I think like it shows, connection happening, community happening among queer men more than we usually think of in that era. People often say that like queerness didn't ever like evolve into a community until quite recently. And I think it probably evolved into very different looking communities, different types of communities, and people may have thought of themselves differently and come together differently. But I think it's definitely inaccurate to say that there was no queer community prior to like the 1960s, because we definitely see that with Steuben. Yeah, so just thank you for the live stream. Thank you for attending. This was a very fun thing to do today. This article was not strictly Hamilton related, but I think it was still a fun thing to do on Hamilton's birthday. It does involve Hamilton, and I think just kind of reminds us all of how interesting this era can be and how these historical figures' lives still have a lot to tell us that we, don't normally read about or research. So yeah, thank you all for coming. I'm going to end the live stream here, but I do plan on doing some more of these. I'm probably, I think, going to record a lot of my podcast episodes live moving forward. I may eventually establish like a regular schedule for that. But yeah, thank you for coming and happy Hamilton Day, everyone.